Have you ever lost your voice? I'm not talking about laryngitis here or the after effects of a particularly raucous karaoke night. I'm talking about that shrinking feeling when you lose all sense of who you are, your confidence, your way in the world. Well, I have, my friend. I think it's been a cocktail of a few things over the years. An exhausting, but not exhaustive combo of the shifting sands of identity, early motherhood, the ravaging of the beast that is perimenopause, social anxiety, masking, burnout, and let's not even mention the pandemic. I have become obsessed with this whole idea of finding your voice and what it means creatively, personally, and collectively when we find it. I want to understand how you find it, and if you've lost it, how do you get it back? Join me as I talk to fascinating people who have found their voices and aren't afraid to use them. People who have found their purpose, their passion, and fearless, authentic expression. I'm talking about writers, activists, artists, thinkers, entrepreneurs. We're going to get into their work and their life stories. How did they do it? What were the turning points? What barriers did they overcome? How did they find the courage? And what tips and tricks do they have to navigate this business of becoming? I'm looking to reclaim my voice, yes, and to get my mojo back, but it's more than that. I want to understand this topic and look at it from all angles: historical, cultural, societal, biological, mythical, even mystical. And most of all, through a female lens. Let's not beat about the bush, it's mostly women I'll be speaking to, with the occasional brilliant man thrown in. But these conversations are for anyone who resonates with the quest. Everybody's welcome. Hi, my name is Jessie. I'm a writer by trade, a novelist by aspiration. I do not have the answers, not yet. I'm not a certified coach with patented life theories or a high-flying CEO with productivity hacks. I am no guru, but what I am is endlessly curious about other people and their stories. I've programmed and run a literary and storytelling event series for over a decade now, so I know firsthand the power that stories have to inspire and transform, and that's what we're here for. So, if you want to find your voice or to be inspired, if you're in a liminal state, a similar boat, if you just really like books or want to feast on the sweeping stories of amazing people's life and work, then this podcast might be for you. Please follow, subscribe, and join me on this voyage into voice. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ours along the way. Hello and welcome to How You Find Your Voice. In this episode, I speak to bestselling author Jennifer Saint about her fifth novel, This Immortal Heart, which charts arguably the original love story, that of Aphrodite and Ares. Jennifer grew up reading Greek mythology and was always drawn to the untold stories hidden within these myths. After 13 years as a secondary school teacher, she wrote her debut, Ariadne, and she's been a full-time author ever since, with all of her books reaching the Sunday Times bestseller list. We talk about mythology, women and power, and Jennifer's own journey to finding her voice as a writer, from a lifelong love of stories to finally giving herself permission to write her own. We talk about Aphrodite as a goddess who's been flattened, sexualized and trivialized, and what it means to restore her complexity. We also talk about Pandora and Helen, women blamed for the chaos created around them, Pygmalion as the original incel, the strange modern pull of tradwife mythology, and why stories still shape what women are allowed to be. Jennifer explains why she was compelled to write this book, even though she didn't think she had it in her to write romance, and what exactly it is about classical mythology that provides endless inspiration and keeps drawing her in. I hope you enjoy it. We're here today to talk about your brilliant new book, This Immortal Heart, which I really enjoyed. From the get-go, it was so transporting. There's this kind of deep eroticism to it, very sort of classical depiction of Aphrodite and her world. We've got the chariot with the winged magical doves. We've got scented bathing pools. It was a really lovely thing to be reading and a really great antidote, I think, to everything that's going on in the world. I wanted to start by asking you, why did you want to write this kind of archetypal love story, the love story of Aphrodite and Ares, and why did you decide to write it now?
It's exactly what you just said in terms of with everything that's going on in the world, I really wanted to create a different one. That's my response, I think. to when things feel really, really dark. I mean, sometimes it's to write a novel that is full of rage and anger and railing against it. And sometimes it's to think, I would like a soft landing. I would like somewhere beautiful to disappear to. And I'd always said, actually, that I didn't think I had it in me to write romance, that I wouldn't be able to find a romance in Greek mythology, that you don't see very much in the way that of healthy romantic love. It'd been something, I think I actually said at an event, somebody asked me, would I write a romance? And I said, oh, absolutely not. And then it was probably only a few weeks after that that Aphrodite came into my head. And it just struck me that, oh, there is one though. There is Aphrodite and Ares. And the difference is that this is a couple who, throughout all of these different stories that interweave, and there's no chronology to mythology, there's no sort of, you can't refer to a reference book and everything is set out neatly. These are stories that have really grown up in this labyrinth, and they're all connected in these various complex ways. But throughout all of that, Aphrodite and Ares keep coming back to one another. She takes other lovers, of course, she's a goddess of love. All of these other things happen to her and she has these other adventures. But Ares is this constant in the background. And I'd written some really, really terrible men of Greek myth. The fact that Theseus, we have him as a hero of Greek myth. And when you just peel back the layer just a tiny, tiny bit, you realise that he is responsible for really, truly terrible acts of violence and cruelty towards others. And so that for me was all about kind of exploring, well, what is a hero, and puncturing that ideal of what we think a hero is. And then you come to somebody like Ares, who you would assume, as the god of war, that he would be monstrous and that he would be terrifying and that you wouldn't be able to find any redeeming features in him. But he's not just this terrifying warrior who has this like great battle cry that can strike fear into the hearts of people miles and miles away if they hear it. He's also this constant, faithful lover. And
is he faithful in that? I was going to ask you about the kind of sources that you went to. That's really interesting. Is he faithful to Aphrodite?
I would say, because there are so few stories that really exist about Ares, and he's always intertwined with Aphrodite. So he really feels like this very constant presence who is steady in a way that is so surprising when his domain, his realm, is all about chaos.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you do bring out a kind of slightly softer side to him as well, or a side that Aphrodite can access, which I found really interesting. The rest of the gods in Olympus, they don't really kind of see that side to him, do they? But there's something about Aphrodite and Ares. Do you think it's about the archetypal opposites sort of being attracted to one another? Do you think that's the case?
It is both. Opposites attract, a really classic enemies to lovers.
Yes.
Good framework to their romance. And it is also, oh, but actually, they're soulmates underneath. Because if you trace at the origins of Aphrodite as a goddess, of her worship, she arises actually from these more ancient goddesses from the East. So there is Inanna, there is Astarte, who were goddesses who were associated with love and war, with fertility and death. So you actually had goddesses who encapsulated both of those forces, because I suppose if you think about it, there are these two very primal impulses that exist within humanity, that impulse of love and desire, and that impulse of violence and conquest. And so you did have these goddesses who did it all. And then Aphrodite kind of emerged, and slowly she lost that part of herself. She lost that war part of herself, and she became this goddess of Cyprus, this love goddess in the Olympic pantheon. And so for me, I felt that perhaps Ares was really, truly her missing half all along, that he was a part of her that had been lost in time. And that's why they were always meant to be together.
I love that idea. And it is a conceit, isn't it, that you kind of find throughout, like, especially Latin love elegy. We see it in Shakespeare, I think, as well, kind of like love is war and the lovers are kind of warriors, essentially. And we do see it in this book as well. So yeah, Ares has quite a different depiction in this book. And Aphrodite does as well. I was really, really interested to find out a bit more about kind of the choices that you made, because I think, just like you said, that you were kind of wanted to change the way that people saw a hero. It feels like you're trying to show a different side to Aphrodite, because obviously she's kind of seen as this, I don't know, she kind of toys with people and uses love as a sort of way to seek revenge. You know, she drives people madly in love. But in this book, she does really care. She's not callous. She cares about the mortals. She takes her responsibilities seriously, and she uses love as a force for good, I would say. How did you go about creating or accessing this side of Aphrodite?
So the depictions of her, I think, are so trivializing and so reductive when you see her portrayed as quite vapid, quite insipid, quite petty and involved in, using love as a weapon and using people as playthings or other gods as playthings. And I think it's always so tempting for people when there is a woman who is powerful to find ways to diminish her and to present her as something much smaller, much vainer, much more spiteful and driven by these much more petty concerns. But I like to take a step back and think about when I'm depicting the gods, what really draws me to them is that they are encapsulated by one defining characteristic. And so to bring them into a novel, you have to really flesh that out and to understand what would actually be driving the goddess of love. And I felt particularly writing this in the 21st century, writing this as a feminist, all these kind of questions about consent and agency and the power to choose were much more present in my mind than they might have been in the minds of ancient writers. So you understand Aphrodite as somebody who wields this enormous power, and I think I'm going to accidentally quote Spider-Man with it, has this huge responsibility because the domains of the goddesses are so utterly central to the continued existence of humanity. You know, you have goddesses who are responsible for the harvest, Demeter. Everybody lives or dies depending on Demeter's benevolence. Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, that is all about the warmth and security of home and family. And Aphrodite is the goddess of love. That is about having something to live for, having a positive reason to live your life. And so much of our lives are driven by love. So many of the choices we make in our life are because of love, because of who we fall in love with, or how we love our children, or how we love our pets, or how we love our family, siblings, friends. Love shapes every aspect of our lives. And so she is actually so much more significant, so much more powerful, so much more important than she is given space to be in these depictions of her as just kind of dropping her dress when we see her in sculpture. You know, this Aphrodite who's there for the male gaze and who exists just as this agent of sexuality, who I think as a woman who wields that power, she can be frightening to men. And so I think that makes them want to make her smaller and make her fit into this little cage. But honestly, in kind of figuring out how to make the goddess of love a fully rounded human being, well, not human being, she's a goddess, obviously, but, you know, fully rounded, relatable, multidimensional and complex, I found myself using Taylor Swift as a model.
No way. You love it.
Just because I thought, how will I have this heroine who had got this status, wields this power, and is compelling and has people adoring her and has this whole string of romantic relationships? It would be very easy to hate somebody like that. And I thought, well, I don't feel like that about Taylor Swift because she, through her music, she is very vulnerable, she's very open, and you believe that from listening to her words, listening to her lyrics, that she is somebody who throws herself in wholeheartedly. And that's what I thought Aphrodite had to do, that when she has a lover, she is all the way in. She is consumed with romantic idealism and optimism. And that opens her up and that makes her vulnerable to pain and hurt. And that made her feel like somebody you could actually access, not somebody very remote, somebody very distant, somebody who you couldn't really warm to. I saw her as this very open, very loving person.
I love that you drew on Taylor Swift in order to create Aphrodite, because she is basically a goddess, isn't she? What she can achieve, and she has got so many followers in the same way. You know, I think there is a kind of link, maybe it's going a bit too far, but it's like big pop stars or artists, they're almost like gods, and they are kind of worshipped by us, aren't they?
I was at the Eras tour a couple of summers ago, and at Wembley Stadium, 92,000 people, mostly women and girls. And there is something about being in a crowd that size that did make me think about that human impulse to come together and to sing. And I thought people have been doing that throughout all of history, throughout all of civilization. This has been a bonding communal experience. And yeah, we don't really have gods anymore, but we do have Taylor Swift.
We do have Taylor Swift. What you said there, I thought that was really interesting about essentially kind of elevating love and what it is. There's a tendency for things that are associated with women or women's spheres, like you just said, Demeter, Aphrodite, Hestia, they're always seen as kind of trivial or less important, but you've really elevated love as a driving force and something as powerful, an antidote to war in this novel, but also just something that is like a primordial force that is important in and of itself. And like you say, in this depiction of Aphrodite, she gives herself wholly to it, and you understand that it's who she is, and if she doesn't do it, then everything starts to unravel a bit. You kind of show that in the book as well, don't you, that the gods have a responsibility, and if they aren't who they are meant to be, then things can go slightly awry.
Yeah, so if you come to Greek mythology as a child like I did, one of those really foundational myths that you hear quite early on is the division of the three realms, where Zeus, Poseidon and Hades carve up the world into three, and Zeus takes the heavens, Poseidon takes the seas, Hades takes the underworld. And those positions, actually, when you think about it, there is an emptiness in that. There is a title, I'm king of the heavens, I'm king of the seas, and king of the underworld. But there is something less defined about it. There is something about the idea that actually the women are taking on the roles that involve the work, and the men are taking on the roles that involve the impressive sounding title. But actually, the female goddesses are out there and keeping things moving rather than just collecting accolades. And I thought that even among the goddesses, there can be kind of a hierarchy, and to think, well, actually, without fire and without crops and so on, everybody would die. So are you going to kind of elevate those goddesses above Aphrodite? And she stands a little bit apart from the others because she has got this different origin story. So I felt like she could kind of stand separately a little bit from the others, and there could be a reason for everybody to perhaps think of Aphrodite as not mattering quite as much. And similarly with Ares, who is such an outcast on Olympus, and he's never involved with anybody apart from Aphrodite. So these two gods, where everybody is looking at them and looking down on them a little bit and kind of thinking, well, we'd rather not have war. It's a really messy business. It's useful for us, but, we don't want to get our hands dirty. And kind of, does love really matter? And I have Aphrodite really directly challenge that. And she points out that it's all very well to keep surviving, but what are you actually surviving for if you don't have love? And I just felt that was so fundamental to the novel, that she is doing the thing that makes everything else worth doing in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I really got that sense of how important it was. And like we discussed earlier, that you really elevated it. Earlier, you were talking about Ariadne, and been thinking about your other books. You seem to be very interested in kind of giving a voice to mythological characters that might have not necessarily had a voice or been sidelined. What do you think draws you to do that? What's your mission?
It's really that I love these stories. I write these books because I love Greek mythology and because I've been obsessed with it my whole entire life, and that obsession has never waned. So I thought, in the end, I had to make a career out of it. But because I love these stories, it means that I want to find more of them. And I see mythology as really this living entity, that it grows and it thrives through retellings and reimaginings. That's how mythology started, through the oral tradition of storytelling, that people have been sharing these myths for thousands of years, informally as well as formally. There are so many versions of them, as many versions as there are people who've told them. And so there is always something else to discover. It's something that I think it stays alive because we keep renewing it and we keep reinvigorating it, and we keep finding different areas where we haven't thought of it that way before. And I've always just wanted to step right into that world. This is how I feel about all books. I think that you read them because you want to step into another world. And when you're reading the myth, you're thinking, well, where do I step into this myth? Where do I feel like I can find a place in them if I'm only reading the stories of the wars and the heroes in severe quote marks there, a very questionable title sometimes. But yeah, where can I find the place for me to enter into them? And that is through the voices of the women. And when you hear a different side to a story that's very familiar, then it can look like something completely different. And I'm just forever fascinated by that. It's so compelling to think I can come to a familiar myth and just ask a few questions. Well, what does it look like if she's telling the story? And why might she have made that decision? I've been told it was for this reason, but actually, what if it was for a different reason? And then you have something completely brand new, and it feels like a miracle every time.
Yeah, it completely shifts the emphasis, doesn't it? It's like endless material, I imagine, for you to mine. What you said just there made me think about how with mythology, even though these stories are so incredibly ancient, there's so much resonance with today, depending on how you interpret it. And there are two references in This Immortal Heart that I found really interesting. And I don't know, I feel like it says quite a lot about where we are today. There was the story of Pandora. There were several things I found really interesting about that. The way you present it. And I'm not so familiar with the original myth, whether it was like a choice that you added onto it, but the very conscious choice that Zeus makes to use that as a story for humanity and the importance of stories and essentially blaming women. Is that a choice that you made, or was that kind of in the original myth?
That was completely me.
Yeah.
Yeah, narratives shape our perception of ourselves and who we are and who we can be. And I think when it's such a powerful weapon that has always been wielded against women is stories of these warning stories of if you step out of line, if you behave in a way that is not compliant with the patriarchy, then you will become vilified, you'll become victimized. All of these terrible things will happen to you, and everybody will blame you for it as well. And those stories, they have such a strong hold in the world, and we are still hearing these stories about women now all the time. And I was so interested, actually, as I was writing this as well, in, we shape our lives through stories on social media such a lot, and literally stories. We put stories on our Instagram. And like everybody else, I've been really, kind of horrified and fascinated at the same time by all the trad wife phenomenon that's existed. And I was really thinking about that in the writing of this novel, because I was seeing Aphrodite as a woman with a career and somebody who, with her own agency, making her own choices, which obviously all these social media influencers are actually doing, whilst
Yes, of course.
a very different story of how women are supposed to be. And I see it on the right, and I see it in this kind of traditionalist propaganda, this idea that women are innately this way, innately aggressive, innately subservient. And you only have to look at the stories we've always been telling to see it's just not the case. We've always been telling stories about women who do make choices and who do wield power. And Aphrodite is an example of somebody who is not controlled and made submissive in the way that the other gods are. When she is made to marry, she also makes a choice to leave her husband, which is kind of unheard of and very, very destabilizing. But I've taken us way away from Pandora.
It's brilliant. It's exactly what I was thinking of a lot when I was reading the book. We can come back to it. This whole trad wife thing, it really comes out, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And when it came to Pandora, she's a myth that's never made sense. There are all these myths that don't make sense because, like I say, there isn't sort of one body. Like nobody's ever kind of been keeping track and making sure that all the myths fit together. So you do get these direct contradictions all the time. But it never made sense to me that Pandora would be the actual first woman, because how are there a race of human beings with no women? It can't exist. So I never found an answer to that. So I felt that, okay, she's not the first woman, actually. That's going to be a story that's told about her. And look at how that story is used. It's used just as Eve is used in the Bible as well, as here is the woman who ruined everything. She opened this box and she released all of every single thing that's wrong in the world. We can just pin it back on Pandora. And it wasn't
pure misogyny from the outset.
And it wasn't a box, it was a vase. And vases are very fragile and breakable. And why did Zeus hide all the ills of the world in a vase and then leave it in Pandora's house anyway?
Yes, set her up.
So I really wanted to expose that as another one of these like kind of fake stories that you can create, that we see being created about women and women's roles today. And I think Pandora, she's very associated with Aphrodite as being the most beautiful woman to ever exist. And then you come back to that again with Helen of Troy, who is also very much linked to Aphrodite. They're almost like Aphrodite's mortal equivalents. And both of them, Pandora and Helen, are blamed for atrocities. Helen is blamed for the entire Trojan War because the idea that a woman could perhaps choose to leave her husband for another man, apparently that completely justifies 1,000 ships assailing a city and causing devastation and the ruin of an entire civilization. We can just blame it on Helen.
Blame it on her. Nothing to do with male ego or the feeling that, women were considered to be possessions a few thousand years ago.
And so, as these women being like versions of Aphrodite who exist in among humans, then I just think you can then reflect that back onto Aphrodite and how, we can go back and we can blame Aphrodite and we can hold her up as an example of a woman who is not complying, not obeying, and therefore we can blame her and we can find that all the faults rest with her and not with men.
She seems to kind of rise above it, which is quite good. She's quite good at playing the patriarchy, I think, in a way. And she's very multidimensional. But I wanted to come back to that idea of the trad wife, because in a way, I feel like everything that you were just describing on social media and how this sort of movement, I guess you could call it, it presents itself. Aphrodite might be, in some interpretations, a bit of a poster girl for a movement because it is about beauty in it, but at the same time, then she isn't that. She's not subservient. Do you see Aphrodite being co-opted in any way? What archetypes do you associate with trad wives?
Aphrodite has been co-opted. I think we can really see that through artistic representations, the way that she becomes increasingly undressed in when she's sculpted, when she's painted, quite often posing in a way that's very coquettish and very much like, here I am for men to look at me. And it kind of, it makes her beauty something that is not hers anymore, but it's something for men to possess. So I can see that she could definitely be co-opted as an agent of the patriarchy, as this woman who is sexually available. And there's the excitement of that, making her kind of the cool girl, as opposed to Hera, who is this like uptight, buttoned up, matronly wife. Maybe Aphrodite is like your much more exciting mistress. And it was really important to me that Aphrodite encounters these stories that are told about her, these stereotypes that are attributed to her. And that, she rises above it because she keeps her eye on what she's doing, what her role is, what her purpose is, how important she is to the rest of the world, and how what she does has got this value to it. And I think women's rights are under this bombardment again. And I grew up through the 90s and, all these different ways of feminism that have happened through my lifetime. I felt that we were moving at least in the direction of more autonomy for women, more recognition of women's voices, more equality for women. And it's really depressing when you realise that all these rights that you just assume once they've been won, they can be rolled back and they can be attacked again. And one of just the most insidious ways that they do it is, I think, through telling stories about women and through creating idealised versions of women. And the whole trad wife aesthetic is extremely appealing and it looks so beautiful. And so you end up with women arguing against their own rights, which I always just find one of the most fascinating things of all. But it's all of a sudden to think that the right to abortion might not be protected, to think that there are people calling for the end of women's right to vote.
There's a kind of a female version of the manosphere now, isn't it? Where kind of women advocate for the same sort of ideals. What are you talking about? Why can't women vote? Yeah.
And the women who are calling for women to have less power are really powerful women. Women like Erica Kirk going out there and talking about, women should just be wives. And you think, aren't you the CEO of a gigantic company? Aren't you kind of out there with a public profile, with status, with wealth, with power, talking? So don't tell other women that they don't have the right to a voice. It's so insidious. It's so poisonous. And I think you can feel so powerless in the world. And there are many things I don't have the power to do, but I do have the power to write stories. And I do think that girls and women, the more versions of ourselves that we can see, both in the real world and in the fictional world, and all of the different things that we can be, the better and more empowered we are.
Absolutely. Galateo is another sort of figure that springs to mind. And again, I felt like it had resonances with today. I kept thinking about like an AI girlfriend.
Oh my God. Yeah, Pygmalion, the original incel. Who creates this woman out of stone. And I wanted to really confront, I think, one of the myths that puts Aphrodite in the worst light, because Pygmalion is this absolute creep who despises women and kind of rails against women. All these women that I see, and all these human flesh and blood women are so disgusting and they're not good enough for me. So I'm going to carve a woman out of stone so that she'll be good enough. And it's definitely in his metamorphoses. He's caressing the statue. It's extremely sinister, his behavior towards this perfect woman who, cannot speak, cannot think. That's his ideal. And then Aphrodite grants him his wish, which is for her to be made flesh. And that can feel really, really problematic. There is Aphrodite acting as this agent of the patriarchy. Is she, giving him, like he said, his AI girlfriend? And she's brought to life from stone. So she's like the perfect woman for a creep like Pygmalion, because she has no experience and she has no knowledge that there even is a world out there. So what can she be apart from his perfect submissive woman who doesn't even know that saying no could be an option, because the only things that she knows are what he can teach her. So I definitely wanted to include that myth and to consider Aphrodite's role in that myth, and to think about the ways in which Aphrodite can learn from experience that. Because when you're dealing with a goddess, when you're taking on an immortal as the protagonist of a novel, because they are ageless, because they will live forever and they have this whole eternity, then where is there room for growth? Where is there room for change? If you are always going to be the same thing, the goddess of love, then you have to kind of really think about ways in which that could evolve, that characteristic can evolve, and her view of her role and her understanding of her own power and what the consequences, what the unintended consequences can sometimes be.
Yeah, I love that. You do see her kind of learning. And I think this is why I love this book and why I love mythological retellings, because it, as you said before, fleshes out all of these myths. And we see that kind of awareness there, don't we? Of, sometimes she acts and then she thinks about it afterwards, like with Phaon as well at the beginning. She learns through doing that kind of maybe there are better ways of doing things than others, which I found really interesting. I feel like marriage is a big theme in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested to kind of ask you about it, because we see Aphrodite constrained by the patriarchy, by Zeus, but she manages to kind of keep her dignity within it. We see Hera, who I know you've written about before as well, who's kind of the poster girl, the goddess of marriage. But poor Hera. I mean, I haven't read Hera, but I really want to go read it, because I think that's a really interesting choice that you went for in exploring her. But also then we have other instances in the book. We've got the myth of the Amazons as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to know, what were you looking to explore about marriage in this book?
So I think it's so interesting, first of all, that the ancient Greeks decided, so we're going to have a goddess of wives, Hera, and then we're going to have a different goddess of love. So we made it very clear those domains are separate. And of course, that makes sense, that marriage is something that is so often and for so long was a transactional arrangement. So love does not have to come into it at all. And Hera really, really does exemplify that, because she's married to Zeus, and who could love Zeus? Nobody. Nice. So first of all, there is something kind of darkly comical about the fact that you have these two different goddesses, that you split the realm up like that. And then it's interesting that then Aphrodite, as the goddess of love, she has to keep having love affairs. So what do you do with a woman like that? It really does link up to the Amazons, in that the ancient Greeks had these really kind of exotic myths about the Amazons who were just really, really compelling to them. They feature in so much ancient art, on so many vase paintings, so many friezes. You just see the Amazons coming up over and over again. So they were obviously really, really fascinating. And I think it is, you can create this patriarchal society where women are possessions and you get married because it's going to be advantageous in terms of like your status or your wealth or something like that. And then you might succeed in making women be your property. But when you get that, I think men realize that that's not what they wanted all along, and they don't like it. And so then you can see that actually they're so interested in this other world where perhaps women behave differently. And wouldn't it be so alluring and so exciting to meet a woman who you hadn't chained to the kitchen sink, for example? Wouldn't it be so exciting to meet a woman who had that freedom and that liberation? And when it came to the Amazons, I depended really heavily on a book, The Amazons by Adrienne Mayer, who explores these real women who did exist, who were not Amazons the way that the Greeks had imagined them, but were clearly women that, as the Greek Empire expanded, they would have gotten knowledge of these women. Like, oh, actually, in this distant land, there are women who ride horses. There are women who fight battles. There are women who live as freely as the men in this place. And so let's make loads of myths about these women because they sound incredible. And like, I agree, they do. And so you do, through archaeology and excavating burial sites, it was assumed for a long time that if you dug up a skeleton and it was buried with armor or with swords, with weaponry, that, oh, you must have been digging up a man's body. But now we can actually find out through DNA testing, we find out there are women warriors who have been buried with this great ceremony, who've been buried with their horses, who've been buried with their weapons, women who were out there fighting battles. And so again, it just like dents another hole in that myth that, hang on, aren't women just like naturally just submissive? Isn't what they really want is to stay at home being married and raising children? All women really want that. And I say this as somebody who's married and has children.
Yeah, of course, it's about the choice, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and the choice to do other things as well. So yeah, so we have got definitive proof that there is not some kind of distant, ideal past world that you could go to where you could prove that all of your ridiculous theories about gender roles are true, because they never have been. These gender roles have always been challenged in various ways by different people. They are not something that just come inherently to us. So to bring the Amazons in, to link them to Aphrodite, just made a lot of sense to me. The Amazons are very much associated with Ares because they are a race of warlike women. But I could see that, no, there's a really good reason for the Amazons to get involved with Aphrodite as well, because she, like them, is a woman who makes her own choices, who is able to exercise her own agency.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And essentially, they're creating a matriarchy on land, aren't they? They want to be able to make their choices of how they want to live or who they want to love. And yeah, I thought that was kind of very interesting how you explained it, that it was clearly through how they were treated by men that they decided that they, wanted to be in control. There's a really interesting quote, I can't remember it off by heart, but essentially, no, we're not going to allow men to come join us because as soon as we do, we'll end up being wives and we won't be able to ride anymore. I thought that was really fascinating. I wanted to ask you what the draw was and if you remember the kind of moment when you fell in love with classical mythology. It's been a passion throughout your whole life.
Yeah, it's really early childhood. So my parents had friends who lived in Cyprus at the time. And so we would go there in the summer on holiday and they would take us out to these ancient ruins and tell us the stories that were behind them. And so it just captivated me. I think it was the idea as a young child that these stories were somehow more real than other stories I'd heard because I was there in the place, and they are, mythology is so very rooted in a sense of place. And the fact that you could see the mosaics that people had made and you could see the sculptures that people had created of these stories. So it felt like, oh, they really, really exist. I'm in the place where there is this palpable connection. And I find it a really optimistic thought, truly. I find it really cheering in, like we've said, these very dark times, that if we are still telling these same myths, if we're still interested in them, you feel this sense of connection across this huge amount of space, this huge amount of time, this completely different culture that existed so long ago. But actually, we are still talking about some of the same things. We're still feeling at our core these same emotions. It makes me feel much more optimistic for the future of humanity in a time when we feel that there are more divisions than ever, because we are aware of so many divisions, because we're bombarded by news of them all the time, that actually, no, there are things that connect us. There are things that unify us just simply as human beings.
Yeah, and the stories and the kind of stories that you choose to tell. There's a part in the book that just made me think of something when Ares says, well, maybe there'll be a time when, there won't be wars. And I thought that was like a really optimistic hopeful thing to think as well, that if even the war god was
Yeah.
half hoping that,
Looking forward to his own redundancy.
I wanted to ask you about your journey to becoming a writer, because you've had phenomenal success in a really quite short space of time. Is this your fourth or fifth book, I think? So before you became a full-time writer, you were an English teacher, so obviously immersed in stories and literature. But I guess I wanted to ask you, do you remember when you decided to really start taking writing seriously, and what was going on in your life at that point?
Yeah, very specifically. So my journey to becoming a published author was something that was both extremely fast and extremely slow, because I had been saying my entire life I wanted to write books. And there was a crunch point in my life when I realized, oh, if I'm going to be an author, I will actually have to write that book. And there's no getting around it. I'm going to have to do it. So it was a New Year's resolution. It was a New Year's resolution that I set on New Year's Eve 2019. I started writing the book on the 1st of January 2019. That was Ariadne. So the idea had been in my head since the previous summer. I had been reading aloud Greek myths to my children. I think, so my eldest, I think he was 5 at the time. I read him the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, and we talked about Ariadne in that story because he was asking questions about her. He was interested to know what happened to her. Where did she go? How come she didn't end up back in Athens with Theseus like he promised? Because he said he was going to marry her. Like he didn't. So he'd asked me that, and that was a real light bulb moment, because I'd studied classics at university. So I knew there were so many more stories about Ariadne. I'd encountered them in my degree, but somehow these were not the stories that I could find to read to my kids. These were not the stories making it into the most kind of mainstream versions of Greek mythology. They were like obscure things you had to go and do a degree to find. So it was floating around in my head. But like you said, I was an English teacher, and teachers are very busy. I had young children. It was on the back burner. Writing was always, always on the back burner. And I realized I am going to have to make this happen. And I'd moved schools, and I'd moved to a school where I felt I had a lot less opportunity to be creative through work, because I'd moved to a school with a much more corporate focus and much more kind of, this is what you are going to teach and this is how you're going to teach it. So I didn't really have a creative outlet through work anymore. And I had this idea for a story. So I started writing it on the 1st of January, like I said. Started writing it in a notebook in a park while my children were playing, until my hands were too cold to keep going anymore. And I was really, really seized by it. I felt that Ariadne's voice came to me. And now I've written 5 books, I'm writing my 6th. I know that that's not always how a novel is born. But in that case, it was. It's the most satisfying way when it comes like a bolt from the blue. But sometimes you do have to dig a bit deeper to find it. But for this one, she was there. And it felt like I went back to a book that I'd read at university, a collection of Ovid's poetry, the Heroides, where he includes a letter from Ariadne, where she is saying to the reader, you need to know my story. And I just felt like, and here it is. And by some kind of magic that I can't explain, I seemed to be able to tell it. So I felt really, there was a momentum to writing that kept me going. And I wrote it very, very quickly, much faster than I can now seem to write a novel. I would sit outside my younger son's bedroom waiting for him to go to sleep. He was a terrible sleeper. So I wrote a lot of Ariadne in notebooks or on my phone, actually sitting on the hallway carpet, waiting for a child to go to sleep. And it was taking off. And I was thinking, well, what am I going to do with this? Because actually, my New Year's resolution had been, I'm going to write a book, but it hadn't been, I'm going to become a published author. And it hadn't been, anyone else is going to read it. It was just, I am going to write something from start to finish. That was my only goal. But as it was taking shape, I thought, no, maybe I will do something with this. Maybe other people would actually want to read it. So I was on what was at the time Twitter. I was started following literary agents and trying to get an idea of, well, how on earth do you actually get a book published? Because I didn't know. I had really no idea. I just had this vague idea, are you supposed to get an agent? Well, how would you get one of those? And I was following one agent in particular who she represented authors who I really admired, Jessie Burton, Stacey Halls. She seemed to be somebody that I just thought, oh, I think she'd be a really good fit. And one day she tweeted that she was looking for an ancient Greek novel. This was around May. And I was like, oh my God, I've got one of those. I hadn't finished it. I was about halfway through. But then she also tweeted that she was taking part in a literary auction. It was to raise money for children who were being separated on the Mexican border from their parents. And there were children in cages was the shocking pictures that we were getting through. Again, wow, things have not moved on and changed. But there we were. They were raising money to reunite these children with their families, immigrant children. And so this agent, Juliet, was offering feedback on the first 50 pages of a novel. And I did not have a complete novel, but I did have 50 pages. And I knew she was looking for an ancient Greek novel. And I had this feeling about her that I thought, this is delusional and this is imaginary. But I entered the auction and I won her feedback. And when I sent her those first 50 pages, she replied and said, I don't want to give you feedback. I want you to send me the whole manuscript.
Wow, I'm getting goosebumps. It's like it's so creative. I mean, it's like a story from Greek mythology.
We said it was like fate, but I didn't have a full manuscript to send her because this was like 5 or 6 months after I'd started writing. And she said, well, that's okay. Just send it to me when you've finished. And honestly, I'd written the first half of that book fast, but I wrote the second half so much faster. We broke up for the summer. I went away with my husband and kids and mother-in-law. We went to a house in France and he and she looked after the boys and I stayed in the house and I wrote and wrote. And then I would come out at the end of the day for an Aperol spritz in the garden.
A well-deserved one.
Yeah, and I came home with a finished novel. So I would never recommend people that you send a literary agent who you really want to impress your first draft. You should never, ever do that. But in these circumstances, I did. I sent it to her. And luckily, she's a very editorial agent. She has great vision. I think the fact that she was tweeting she wanted an ancient Greek novel just shows how much vision she had, that actually this is something that people are going to really be interested in. So I sent it to her. She offered me representation, and this was August. So I'd started writing on the 1st of January, and I just thought, oh, by this time next year, I'd like to have a completed first draft. But by August, I had a complete first draft. I had a literary agent, which was just beyond anything I could have dreamed of. We worked on the novel for another couple of months, and by November, she sent it out on submission, and I was offered a publishing deal in a preempt. And by Christmas, I had left teaching.
Wow, so quick. It was like really condensed time frame. It was amazing.
Yeah, it all happened very quickly.
And thank God it did, because now you've written, yes, as you say, you're on your 5th book. I wonder how the second book was to write. It sounds like your first book, Ariadne, was written in this sort of intense creative sort of flow that had to come out. And often I think with authors or musicians or any artist, the second album, the second book that can be a bit harder. How did you approach your second novel?
Yeah, I think second novel syndrome is such a real thing. I wrote Ariadne in 2019. So obviously, at the end of 2019, I left teaching, became a full-time author on the 1st of January 2020. Well, you know what happened then?
Pandora.
And the second novel was written, I just managed to leave teaching and suddenly I was homeschooling my children, which was never something I wanted to do. And we were all locked down. And I think if you were writing, no offense to my children, but if you didn't have kids and you were a writer, lockdown was probably a great opportunity to write. But I had kids. My husband works for the NHS, so he was going to work as normal. So it was incredibly pressurized circumstances. And I was writing this incredibly dark novel. Electra is a story in the backdrop of the Trojan War is the backdrop to the novel. It's based on Greek tragedy. It's just an incredibly intense, incredibly dark subject to delve into. And it felt like the end of the world was happening.
No escape, no respite outside or inside. Yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah, it was really tough. And it was my first experience, obviously, of writing under contract and writing to a deadline. And that creates a completely different pressure. You know, I think that Ariadne was able to come out in this creative force unimpeded because I didn't have anybody else's voices in my head while I was writing that novel, because I did not expect a single other person to read it. The first person who did read it was my agent. I didn't even show it to my husband or my mum or anybody before her. So I never had to think, how would somebody read this? But when I was writing Electra, I was also editing Ariadne. I was working with my editors to get that novel ready for publication. So I had this insight into, oh, okay, right, you have to think about what other people are going to say. And then you start to anticipate somebody else's opinion. And I think the louder that those voices get in my head, and they've only got louder really since, because as the books go out into the world, then people read them, there are reviews, there's this huge wave of feedback that you get. Some of it incredible, some of it amazing, and obviously some of it a lot less so. But you suddenly realize there are so many different ways that people can respond to my work, and people are going to respond to it because people actually are going to read it. And that can be hugely inhibiting. So Electra was also a triple viewpoint. So I had 3 different POV narrators to interweave. So structurally, it was very complex. Thematically, it was incredibly grim. And there was these external pressures that had never, ever existed for me before. So it was very, very difficult. And I think it's sometime in the summer, they started to open things up again. And I booked a cottage just for me by the sea. And I went away for a week and I just worked on it. And I needed that peace and I needed that space. And I needed for the house to be quiet around me. And that allowed all the other voices that were competing for attention in my head to quieten down as well.
Yeah, you needed that focus. So what I'm hearing is that being kind of conscious of how you're going to be received or having different opinions can impact your own voice and your own writing. How do you navigate that now as you've gone on through your career?
So there are really wonderful things about it, because I will say that the best bit of my job, I feel so often, is the editing process, is that moment when other people step into this world with me and they help me figure out the map through it. It's such a transformative process, editing a novel. I'm not a fan of the first draft, I've got to say. It's messy and it has to be messy. And you have to make a certain number of wrong turns and mistakes in order to find the story that you want to tell. And I don't like that. I am quite a perfectionist at heart. So I find it really, really difficult to know that I'm going to mess up and get things wrong. But when you're editing, you are fixing those things and you are making them right. So I much prefer that part of it. So when I hear my editor's voices kind of getting involved, that is a really helpful and useful part of the process. But it slows me down, because even in the drafting now, I'm kind of thinking, oh yeah, that's going to get picked up. I can kind of tell more and more as I get better at my craft. I can kind of tell, okay, yeah, this isn't going to work at all. This needs fixing. And I find it really hard to move past it without fixing it on the spot. So there's a way in which those voices are useful and helpful, but that's a certain number of trusted voices of people who share the same vision. And I think that's the really magical thing, is finding the editor who really does understand what you want to achieve. And I've just worked with such amazing women on my books that I'm so grateful for that experience. The voices that are not helpful is all the noise that kind of comes from reviews. And both good and bad reviews, I think, can be unhelpful in their own ways, because when I start to write a new novel, I'll be thinking, all the things that people loved about Ariadne, for example, oh no, I don't have them in this novel. So all those great reviews, those people are going to be disappointed. And all the bad reviews, they stay in a way that can just never be erased. I can remember whole sentences from bad reviews that I've seen, because some people don't have any manners and they'll tag you on Instagram, so you don't realize.
Oh no!
Never seek out reviews. I did with my first book, I will say. I think that golden rule of don't read reviews. As a debut author, you probably are going to break that rule and you are going to seriously, seriously regret it. So I know kind of intimately everything that people did not like about that first book. And yeah, some of those haunt me. But the very, very first review that I saw of my work at all was an American trade publication reviewed Ariadne before it had been published. And it was an evisceration.
Oh no.
It was like the very first kind of external response I'd had, because up until then, the only people who'd read it had been people who were working with it on me, people who really loved it, family members. So I was completely unprepared for that. So yeah, I can still remember most of that one verbatim, and it does come back to haunt me sometimes.
Well, that's the thing about art, though, isn't it? I guess you have to have quite a thick skin if you're going to be a published author. But for every sort of eviscerating review, there's going to be a glowing one, because art is subjective, isn't it? And I guess you can't predict who's going to connect with your words and the story that you're trying to put out there. And maybe it won't be for everyone, but it will definitely be for someone. I suppose that's kind of a comfort, isn't it?
Well, it definitely won't be for everyone. I think that can be the paralyzing thing, to be honest, because if you overthink it, and I am an overthinker, you realize that because you can't please everyone with a novel, you start to think, oh, whatever I do, somebody's going to hate it. And if you let yourself fixate on that, then you can just grind to a halt altogether. So the writing process just involves quieting those voices as much as possible.
That's really interesting. So this is a podcast, obviously, about finding your voice. I always ask guests what advice they would give to a woman who perhaps is trying to reconnect with her voice or find her voice in some way. Have you got any advice? What would you say to her?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I do think that the only way to find your voice in writing is to write, and to write as much as possible and think as little as possible in terms of that overthinking, obviously not just writing nonsense. But yeah, to write as unself-consciously as you can and to write as honestly as you can. But the only way that you find it is by getting words on the page. Sometimes that voice just kind of emerges and it's unexpected, but you don't know that it's emerging until you start writing. And you have to, I think that the things that are going to try and stop you from writing are self-doubt and fear of criticism and fear of rejection. And those are not things that are ever going to be helpful or useful to you. So you just have to write. And I think the more that you write, the more faith you have in your ability to do it. And you will make discoveries that you have no way of knowing that you're going to make until you just start the process. So stop thinking and just start.
Love it. If you were going to be one of the goddesses, who would you be? Who do you feel most kind of affinity with?
So sometimes I'd like to be Artemis and just run away to the forest. But I think I would probably go for Hestia, just on the basis that she does not really appear in any myth, and therefore she stays out of the drama. I'm very conflict avoidant. I wouldn't last very long on Mount Olympus. So I think I'd have to be Hestia and just sit back and let everybody else get on with all of their escapades.
Love that. Who's your favourite female writer of all time?
Oh, so many. So many. I think I would have to pick probably Barbara Kingsolver. The Poisonwood Bible is probably my favourite novel of all time. If you are looking to escape into another world, she is just the best at doing that.
It's a good choice. You said you're working on a 6th book. Are you allowed to talk about it, or are you allowed to share who the mythological figure is? Because I've been trying to work out who you might focus on next.
So it's very early stages, so I can't kind of say anything about it now, but it's a dual narrative. So I have 2 really great women of Greek mythology whose voices I have really enjoyed starting to uncover.
Oh, well, I can't wait to read that. Thank you so much for speaking to me. I've absolutely loved talking to you about your brilliant book and your writing process. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of How You Find Your Voice. I love a mythological retelling and adored talking to Jennifer. I really admire her mission to portray the women and goddesses of myth as rounded, complex figures rather than mere symbols or stereotypes, and to uncover what these ancient archetypal stories still have to say about the world we live in. One moment that stayed with me is when Jennifer talks about how, when a woman is powerful, people find a way to diminish her. We see it repeatedly from Aphrodite and Pandora in this novel, 2 women in the public eye today. Again and again, there's this impulse to tear a powerful woman down, to rewrite them as something smaller, usually, more malleable, easier to control. I really enjoyed Jennifer's own story of becoming a writer. That moment when she realised that she was just going to have to make it happen. The image of her writing Ariadne in notebooks with frost-bitten fingers in the park, or on her phone outside her son's bedroom. And the way it all unfolded in that weirdly fated, almost mythic way feels a very fitting origin story somehow for a writer of these novels. If you enjoyed this episode, do follow the podcast, leave a review or share it with someone who loves mythology, storytelling or complicated women. It really helps an independent podcast like this one. And if you'd like more conversations like this, along with behind-the-scenes reflections and thoughts on books, creativity and voice, you can join the How You Find Your Voice Substack. It's a new space to go a little deeper into the ideas, books and conversations that sit behind this project. I'd love to see you there. The link's in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Until next time.